BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Kaz Graham, and this is the Farming Today podcast. Thanks for joining us. In today's episode, we are scanning for lambs on a Cumbrian sheep farm. And will the collective voice of the supermarkets make a difference on inheritance tax for farmers? We'll have more on that a little later. First, though, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of the world because of the large amount of grain it exports. But since the Russian invasion in 2022, grain production has been hampered, not just by the war, but because Russia has been accused of stealing grain from occupied areas of the country and selling it on the black market. Now, the UK is launching a grain verification scheme that will enable Ukraine to trace grain from its harvests and hopefully stop it from being stolen. It uses chemical analysis to determine where grain was grown and a specialist database. Victor de Klerk is the Director of Science at World Forest ID, the non-profit organisation which has created the verification scheme.
We're all about making supply chains transparent, specifically when it comes to timber, soy, cocoa, coffee, grains, agricultural crops, and so on. What we do is we collect samples all over the world, we analyze them for their chemistry or any other characteristics that we can use, and then we make fancy machine learning models that allow us to say where something comes from when we do get a test case or we want to trace something back to its origin.
And how are you able to tell where specific samples of grain come from?
So when something grows in a certain location in the world, it will have a different chemical fingerprint because the rainfall is different, the temperature is different, the soil is different. So a plant that grows in Belgium, where I am right now, and a plant that grows in Ukraine will have a very different chemical fingerprint. And we basically make maps of these chemical fingerprints that then allows us to trace back a product when we have to test it.
And how complex is that science, and how accurate is that science?
Accuracy is a good question. It really depends on what area you're looking at and what the exact question is that you need to ask. These things can change quite rapidly over a landscape, so you are able to pick up differences over short distances. The science sounds a lot more complex than it is. This type of science has been used for a long time in the food industry. It's mainly then the artificial intelligence and the machine learning that comes afterwards that empowers the data that allows us to answer these questions quite accurately.
And can you give me a couple of examples of how this technology, this science has been used before?
A good example of this is actually from the timber industry. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, all timber that enters the EU from Russia or Belarus is illegal. It's not allowed, so it's sanctioned. So we did the same thing with timber, and we were able to already identify quite a couple of shipments that contained illicit timber coming from Belarus or from Russia.
How does the system work? How will the verification system work?
So once the database is created, and we've created the machine learning models that allow us to trace a product back to where its original harvest location, as we say, then any chemical lab within the world, within the EU or within Ukraine, could perform the necessary chemical measurements, ping it against the system, and they will get a response back of where that grain was originally harvested.
How much impact does verification like this have? What kind of difference can it make?
Well, it's a massive industry, right? If you look at natural resource crime, it's $150 billion a year, mainly on illegal timber and illegal wildlife trade. So even stopping just a fraction of that has a massive economical impact. And it also protects the market for the good players, as we say.
That's Victor de Klerk. Now, all this week, we've been taking a look at the kinds of jobs that farmers are getting up to at this time of year. For sheep farmers, January is scanning time. That's when pregnant ewes are scanned to see how many lambs they're carrying. Knowing how many new arrivals to expect makes things a lot easier come lambing time. And it also tells farmers how well their rams or tups are performing. Dan Tailforth's dad started out as a sheep scanner in Cumbria 40 years ago. And today, Dan follows in his footsteps. He's in constant demand from December through until March. But our reporter Helen Millican managed to catch up with him and discovered that the key to successful scanning isn't just sophisticated equipment. You also need spray paint, a sturdy notebook and a lot of teamwork.
Another day, another set of pregnant ewes for Dan Tailforth to scan. Today, on the east fellside slopes of the Eden Valley at Crindledyke, it's the North of England mules belonging to Mark Bowman.
I've got half an eye on Dan with his scanner and half an eye on Chris seeing how he marks the sheep. Singles will be marked on the shoulder, twins will be left with no marks on them because hopefully the majority are twins. Triplets will have a mark on the rump. so that we can move into the year knowing how many lambs are expecting, and also take the geld ones out, the ones without the lambs in, and they'll probably be sold.
How tense a day is this for you then?
It's probably quite good that we stand quite a few before you arrive today, Helen, because there was a lot of triplets in the first lot. Luckily my wife's gone to work because she feeds the pet lambs, and so she's going to be none too pleased when she finds out there's a lot of multiple births, but it's your lamb crop for the year and it's your income.
I notice you're not looking over Don's shoulder.
I'll tell you so, I've been looking at that screen for years and I still can't fathom it out. Luckily for us, Stan knows what he's doing.
1. My first port of call is to make contact with the sheep, and once I've created the contact, the screen will then just look like blobs and scribbles to everybody else. The blobs, that shows us that the yow's in lamb, and then I've got to search through the blobs and find heads and rib cages. We've got 2 skulls on the screen there, go through the womb, out at the far end, and there's 2 bodies just there.
How important is timing when you're scanning?
I can only see pregnancies from 40 days, so anything below 40 days doesn't show up on the screen to me, so she'll be gelled. At the other end, if she gets over the 80 to 90 days, on these type of sheep, where you're looking for triplets, quads, you need the lambs a bit smaller so you can find them all. Otherwise, once the lambs grow, they start blocking each other out. At 75 days today, the lamb inside the sheep's probably the size of your thumbnail to your thumb, and if it gets any bigger than that, it just becomes a lot harder. Having the sheep presented empty, so they've been off silage overnight, allows us to be more accurate with the job we're doing.
I imagine when your dad started mine, the equipment would not be quite so sophisticated.
No, when he first started, they had to turn the sheep upside down and sit it on its bum, and they would clip the wool off its belly and scan it that way. They then developed to this side crush where the sheep just runs in and stays standing.
Less stressful for the sheep.
Yeah, and less labour intensive. This way the sheep's just in and it's out, it's gone. It doesn't know it's happened. So as far as it knows, all I've done is rub its belly and it's gone again. So it's not stressful for her at all, really. Great team here today. Just runs so smooth, got a nice long race, plenty of pens back there. People that know what they're doing, and the sheep just keep flowing right through. My end, you couldn't ask for any better, really.
And I noticed a little bit less high-tech, you have a notebook.
Oh, call this the Bible. If the farmer presents every batch separately, we record the batches separately for them, so that then they know that tub's maybe performed a bit better than another one. We tell them how many singles, how many twins, how many triplets, how many quads, how many late tup sheep they've got, the total and the percentage of what that batch has done for them.
That's one heck of a data collection exercise, isn't it?
That's the Bible.
You're getting a glowing report, Mark, for your exceptionally well-prepared sheep. What happens next?
These will all get split up, and it's particularly the triplets you want taken out of the batch, and we'll start feeding fodder bait to them, up in the game as far as the feeding goes. You're just trying to do what's within your power to help the sheep and also help yourself.
So you're going to sleep well tonight then?
Yeah, I won't be waking up thinking what a mess I've got. I'll be quite satisfied at the end of the day that up to press we've done our job well, and thankfully so have the sheep and the tups.
That's Cumbrian sheep farmer Mark Bowman talking with Helen Milliken. Farmers will not be allowed to use neonicotinoid pesticides on sugar beet crops this year, after an application for emergency use was turned down by the government for the first time. Chris Ledyard has the details.
Neonics are used by farmers to protect sugar beet from virus yellows, a disease spread by aphids. But they're toxic to pollinators like bees. Because of that, they were banned by the EU back in 2013 for use on oilseed rape, then in 2018 for use on sugar beet. Those bans were carried over into UK law after Brexit, but since then the government has granted an emergency authorisation for neonics to be used on sugar beet for 4 years in a row. An application went in over the summer for another emergency authorisation, but that has now been turned down. The NFU has said it's disappointing and says growers are left without a single viable solution to protect their crop in 2025 if disease pressure is severe. Meanwhile, environmental groups have welcomed the decision, but some want the ban now to be extended beyond agricultural use to things like garden sprays and pet flea treatments.
Chris, thank you. Now, this month has seen no let-up in the dispute over the proposed inheritance tax on farms. Tomorrow, the UK's farming unions are planning what they call a Day of Unity. The NFU says farmers will be gathering at venues across the UK to show MPs that they're determined to continue their campaign. Earlier in the month, the DEFRA Secretary, Steve Reed, said he was sorry decisions had upset farmers, but argued stable finances are the foundation of the economic growth needed, and outlined a new deal for farmers that would help them become more profitable. Meanwhile, the supermarkets have added their voice to the argument. Tesco, Asda, Morrisons, Lidl, Booths, the list goes on, are all asking the government to reconsider the tax. I asked Dr. Kamran Maroof, Associate Professor in Supply Chain Analytics at the University of Bradford, why the supermarkets are lobbying the government on this.
We've got to really appreciate, the downstream consequences of farmers having to pay this in inheritance tax. And what does that actually mean then for supply chains? And if we look at, historical shortages that we have had, either when farmers have protested or when there hasn't been produce, it leads to disrupted supply chains.
There are some very big businesses involved in this. Do you think that they could change government policy?
I mean, we've seen this in the past. We have seen supermarkets, big brands, big names get together and lobby in the past. We've seen, even with the sugar tax in recent times, and even to some extent, the Brexit and trade policy. So supermarkets do have clout and they do have the ability to lobby. And of course, let's not forget, this doesn't do any harm to public image for supermarkets, who often are seen in a very negative light. So yes, they do have the ability to influence, but equally, there's a real concern for supermarkets that if these tax burdens are not alleviated, it could impact the sector as a whole and lead to, volatility within supply chains.
I mean, Morrisons recently had one of its food depots blockaded by tractors, which did stop distribution and which did lead to empty shelves. Could it be that the supermarkets are actually just now saying this could have really immediate consequences for us because farmers are getting so cross about it?
Yeah, most definitely. And that's just one example of a disruption happening from a supermarket perspective. It's them needing to protect their supply chains and protect, I would say, the long-term stability of the agricultural sector as a whole.
We've asked most of the supermarkets if they would speak to us about this. And as yet, we haven't been able to secure an interview with any of them at all. And I think that's quite interesting. Why do you think that might be? What are the risks for them?
I think at this moment in time, things are moving fast. Your supermarkets probably would want to put a unified response out rather than individually. I mean, they've cited support, of course, for the farmers in the media. But I think at this moment in time, you probably have Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Morrisons on speed dial to one another, speaking about how they can potentially join forces to help support the farmers and influence policy. So I think it's a little early for them to comment.
Yeah. I mean, the more cynical of our listeners may say that Rachel Reeves has been absolutely adamant that she will not be making any changes to this policy. So the odds are that the supermarket's involvement won't achieve anything, really, apart from good PR for the supermarkets. I mean, if the supermarket sector really wants to support farmers, why don't they just pay them a bit more for what they produce?
Exactly that. And this goes back to a more fundamental question around supermarket dominance and to what extent they can remain competitive. And we've also got to understand it from a consumer point of view as well. In the UK, unfortunately, we are very resistant to price fluctuations. If the customers are willing to have the cost passed on to them, it then means that the supermarkets are a little bit more flexible. So ultimately, it does go back to the broader systemic challenge that we have faced.
That's Dr. Kamran Maroof from the University of Bradford. And that's it from us for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer is Heather Simons. And Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.